Well, there was a time when homes had typically one or two designated places where all members of a household would eat together at least 2 times a day. The kitchen and the more formal dining room, perhaps. Meals might have been modest or elaborate, casual or elegant, and they happened in homes where there was food that was plentiful, and they happened most every day. But this is not the norm in many, if most households now, because 3 things happened in the last half century that changed how and when we dine. Some of you may remember when there were no electronic devices in a household. Some of you are thinking that's just bizarre. But there were times, some of you may remember, when you didn't have a television. And I've heard you all describe when you first got that black and white television. Some of y'all remember that? And so instead of listening to the radio, now there was a box with a black and white screen that people could sit in front of and watch. And so very quickly followed the creation of TV dinners. Do any of y'all remember that? That was a little bit before my time, in 1954, but how did they come about? Well, because now you could get out of the dining room or the kitchen and you could go sit in front of that black and white television with your TV dinner, which for y'all that don't know what that is a little aluminum tray, and it had little, I guess a different thing in each little thing, in each little section, like meat or vegetables or whatever. And you would sit there so you could multitask. That was early multitasking. Remember? And then there was another way of dining, which was more familiar to me, which was the norm, which was fast food. Now, I remember when there was only one McDonald's and one Burger King and a few other places in my hometown. But that's kind of what I grew up on as, not eating at the kitchen table or the dining room table. And even though many of you women did work outside your homes, the typical model, so they say, in our country was that women were working inside their homes, and so you were preparing meals. But as more and more women went to work in the last few decades outside the home, there wasn't the time to prepare meals that there had been. And so the TV dinners and takeout became a norm for many of us. That's for some of you, that's really all you know. Well, fast forward again to 2019, and what dots our landscape more than anything else? Fast food restaurants selling anything you can imagine. And for many of us, eating in our vehicles has become a way of life, right? As we move from one place to the other. Now this is true. I am sure my first car did not have a cup holder. Remember that? And I'm pretty sure that my second car, it came with it as an option. And now the little ones in our families have car seats with cup holders, right? Yep. And my little ones, they have cup holders and then a little place for their snack bag in the car. So it's all changed. But back in our homes, the challenge may well be, how do we eat without being on an electronic device of any kind? You don't need a TV dinner to go sit in front of a television in one room. You can take your device and eat out of a bag in any room in your house, and many of us may find ourselves doing that. Many people in the same household having a meal, but in different places with different options in front of us, different meals. It also happens in restaurants. Maybe some of us have done this. I'm not going to name any names, but you've been in a restaurant and you look at a table full of people and everybody's having a meal together, but everybody's on a device. Well, this is the world that we live in, and we can't paint that as all bad. But many of us have recognized that when we don't eat mindfully in community with others, we may be missing something. We know that the act of sharing a meal is an act of hospitality, and hospitality always makes room for one more person at the table. It's not an accident that so many of the stories we have about Jesus involve eating, and it is a central setting in Luke's gospel for Jesus' ministry of teaching. Jesus talked a lot about food and hospitality, and there are lots of references to eating and banquets and weddings and dinings and how all of that happens, particularly in Luke, as Jesus builds relationships and teaches around a common table. Well, in this text that we've read this morning, Jesus is breaking boundaries because we're told that he has been invited to the house of a Pharisee for a Sabbath meal. So right there we know that there's some very prescribed ways of doing things. The Pharisees were the ones who kept the laws of the synagogue, and they were there and it was Sabbath. So you know that things are going to need to happen in a certain way. Now, Jesus was, of course, very intentional about where he dined and with whom, and he often invited himself to people's houses. And sometimes, as we know, they were to the homes of people described as sinners and outcasts and criminals, but he also ate with a lot of really important people. As he was in this occasion, we can assume that the really important people in the synagogue were all there. Well, now, it was the job of the Pharisees to keep the laws of the religious culture, and they had a lot of customs and social codes that they had to adhere to. And they knew that Jesus was constantly pushing those boundaries, and so it tells us that they were watching him. They were just daring him to violate those codes. And sure enough, Jesus observed what was going on, and then, as he often did in such a fine teaching method, he told them a parable. And he upped the ante right away by not only setting a meal in a home, but setting it in a wedding. So a wedding ceremony, then as now, and a meal afterwards has a lot of occasion for social blunders, right? Well, his message couldn't have been clearer. You all should be taking care that there should be people here who are the lowest, and they should be given a place of honor. He's telling this as if this is at the wedding where a lot of people were there. But then very quickly after the parable, he shifted gears to what's going on at hand, and he says to the Pharisee, who is his host, there should be others here. You haven't even invited them here. We're all here together, and this is a nice gathering, but you haven't invited all the people that should be at this table. Now, hospitality was a foundational element of the Hebrew tradition, and Jesus knew it well. He knew his tradition. But interestingly, it had a lot of codes and it had a lot of parameters to it. So while there were a lot of things that told you how to be hospitable to the people in your group or your home, the assumption was they were pretty much just like you. You wouldn't have mixed genders and cultures and status and class and languages. You just would never have done that. But that's what Jesus was constantly doing. He could applaud them for being hospitable to those who were just like them. But then he went further and said, but there need to be other people here. Well, Christian hospitality is grounded in Jesus' teachings and in these stories about how he expanded the bounds of what was normative. And honestly, what is normative for most of us is what is most comfortable. It just is. That's human nature. And so challenging ourselves to go beyond that, to invite others in who might not normally be in our space, can be the hardest thing for us to do sometimes. But as we're reminded in Hebrews, we should not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, we may have entertained angels that we were not aware of. It's a beautiful verse. Well, and in our understanding of Christian hospitality, Jesus has a dual role because he is the host as we think about being in and through Christ, but he is also a potential guest. And he reminds us that we are to feed the hungry and welcome the strangers because that is what he did, and that is what he calls us to do. For Jesus, it wasn't just enough to feed people, although he did that, and he made sure that was done, and we need to do that as well. But he wanted to present this idea of table fellowship, where the faces around the table didn't all look alike, where those that would not otherwise gather at a table were together for a common meal. And so we practice hospitality because it gives us an opportunity to welcome Jesus himself in the form of people who are hungry and thirsty and homeless and sick and in prison. For as we are reminded in Matthew 25, I, Jesus, was a stranger and you welcomed me. It could be Jesus himself. It is Jesus himself in the face of all around the tables. So over the centuries, the question about how to treat strangers has been intensified as we have thought more and more about how we can bring folks into community, how those in need aren't just dealt with out there somewhere, but they are part of our fellowship. Well, when talking about the wedding banquet in the parable that he told, Jesus well knew how important rituals were. The males would have reclined on couches. The center couch would have been the place of honor. And those who were, of course, close to the bride and the groom would have been chosen according to wealth or power or office. And if somebody arrived too late to get one of those spaces, then if somebody less prestigious was in the wrong place, they would have moved them. And you know, weddings are still fraught with this kind of stuff. We had a wedding a few weeks ago in our family. One of my cousin's sons got married in South Carolina, and there was a big issue right before the wedding in the reception venue about who was going to sit where. It was a large wedding party, and there just was not room for all of the most important tables to be up in the front near the bride and the groom and near all the wedding party. And the bride had two sets of parents, and so that was part of the issue, is they all wanted to be up there, and then my cousin and her husband and all of our family. And so I really didn't get involved in all that. I just knew it was happening, and they were moving, cards around with people's names on them. But in the middle of the reception, I noticed that the aunt and uncle and cousins of the groom were sitting back in a far corner. And I thought, why is Susan and Nolan and their family back there? So I asked my cousin, who's the mother of the groom, and she said, well, Susan saw what was going on before the wedding, and she just walked up and said, put us back there. It's fine. We don't have to sit up here, just because we can, because we're the aunt and uncle and family of the groom. And so very quietly, they just moved to the back corner, and so the other family that was upset because they weren't in the right place was changed around. And I thought, what a hospitable, gracious thing to do, because she could have easily said, no, our family's been seated here. That's what it says on the cards. Leave us alone. It was a simple thing, but that probably went a really long way toward blending those two families, and certainly toward helping the bride and groom not be so anxious about who was seated where, so that all of the guests were comfortable. And that's really what we're supposed to be about, whether we're at a fancy wedding or whether we're in our homes or wherever we have opportunity to be hospitable. How do we do that in a way that just makes it all work? So that Jesus, in the midst of all of that, would say, that's what hospitality is. Well, Jesus' model of relationship was to always remind us that we can put ourselves in the lower place even if we're entitled to a higher one. And of course, in this parable, he made it clear that there needs to be a place for everyone. And then that's what he said to the Pharisee as well. This is a lovely meal, but you should have others here. And this is the heart, of course, of Christian hospitality, to embrace all people as Christ embraces us. Well, the way that we have eat certainly has changed, hasn't it? And again, eating meals in our cars and at our desk and in front of electronic devices may need to be done, but it doesn't invite much community. And so we just have to be more intentional about when we have community. And one of the places that is the most powerful symbol for us is this table right here. We're going to celebrate our Christian family meal in just a few moments. And it's significant that in every religious tradition, there is a portion of their culture that involves a meal, that involves hospitality, for human community realizes the connection between health for body and health for soul, whatever you call God. And as we come to this table, we certainly recognize that Christ is there, that we are all there with people we know and people we don't know and people even beyond these walls. And we, of course, all come from different families. We have different family situations in the households in which we lived. Some of us may have sacred meals that we used to share with family. Some of us may never have had that. But whatever our experiences elsewhere, this is where we come around one table together. This is where we come and we share the simplest elements of the earth, bread and grape, to remind us that it doesn't have to be fancy. It just has to be caring and open, and that there is always a place set for that person who's just coming in the door. If not today, then maybe the next time. It is here that we are reminded that this is really about something so much bigger than we are. It is about being connected to the host, who is Christ himself. And so as we come to this table, you may not have ever been here. You may have been away for a long time. Perhaps you have purposely excluded yourself. Maybe you think you wouldn't be welcome. But the host himself is indeed inviting all of us, reminding us that there is room for all. And so as we come to this Lord's table, may it be so not only here, but in our tables as well. Amen.